What's happening, everybody? It's me, Robert Phoenix, and welcome to another edition of Sunday Night Astro Live. I just realized that the opening track has a kind of galloping tempo to it, just kind of galloping forward into the stars and the symbolic language that the stars often represent in our lives. In many cases, that symbolic language becoming something quite real when it's meaningful or seen in a series of patterns, consequences, synchronicities, layers of depth and meaning, and all of a sudden we start to pay attention. So I hope everyone is having a wonderful Sunday evening. I just saw Maria from France in the chat. So what time is it over there? 6 hours difference. Maria is burning the midnight oil. And anyway, Maria, I hope you had a good Sunday. And we'll send you off to sleep tonight, hopefully with not too many nightmarish visions of the horror of Babylon, which we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to be going back in time and looking at the 1960s, where everything turns. Everything turns. And I've talked about this before. And I've talked about certain pieces around it before. And I don't know if I've put them all together succinctly, and I'll try and be as succinct as possible tonight. But also looking at the upcoming eclipse because of the eclipse's energy in the sign of Aries, which I really think is a harbinger of what's to come. And I'm getting a little glitchy around the edges, aren't I? Let me just do this. You may see me get a little, just trying to clean up that edge a little bit right there. That's it. That's better. That's better. All right. And I didn't even have to phase out. Yeah, and the eclipse is a harbinger for what's coming, like where things are headed ultimately, because they are. Saturn, Neptune conjunction in Aries at the end of 2025. So the Aries shift is pretty significant. So I feel like in a lot of ways, what we're going to be looking at with the eclipse and beyond is, to some extent, and it's not an echo of the 1960s. It's more of a psychic backlash of the 1960s. And I'll get into the wheres and whys when we get there, when we start to try to draw this thing, bring this thing into the station tonight. We'll also look at the chart of the moment, which I think is always an interesting thing to do, to see where things are, where you are, where we all are, and kind of riff and float on the meaning of these constellations. You know, I watched this interview partially yesterday and part of today with this guy, Carlos Alomar. And Carlos Alomar used to play guitar mainly for David Bowie. Like, he was David Bowie's guitar player and musical director for almost 30 years. But he's played with a ton of other artists as well. And if you can track down this interview with Carlos Alomar, it's really, really interesting. Like, I had no idea Carlos Alomar was that interesting. I always liked him. I always liked his guitar playing. But like, this guy's just incredibly spiritual. And you can see his astrology. Like, I don't have a chart for him, but I looked up his planets last night, and you can see his astrology clearly in his planets. So he has Saturn in Virgo, and he actually talks about, like, being of service in context to working with David Bowie. Like, oh, isn't that a Saturn Virgo kind of deal, right? And he talked about, you can be chummy with him when you're at the bar and having a drink, but when it comes to working with somebody like Bowie, you don't want to show them up. I thought, oh, well, that's very Saturn Virgo. And then I came to find out that Carlos Alomar was married at the age of 17. And by the age of late 18, 19, was basically, starting the formation of the house band at the Apollo in Harlem. And one of his high school buddies was Luther Vandross. So Luther Vandross and Carlos Alomar, Luther took Carlos down to the Apollo, and that's how he got connected to Dennis Davis and George Murray, who would eventually become the Apollo house band along with Carlos. And Carlos was young; he was like 18, 19 years old, and he's doing all this stuff. So I looked up his planets, and he has a Sun, Moon, Mars, all conjunct in Taurus, trine Saturn in Virgo. And I thought to myself, that's somebody, number one, who is dedicated, works hard. He's still the same woman, by the way, whom he married at 17, and was just incredibly industrious. And what's interesting about Carlos Alomar, he doesn't really learn how to play the guitar until he's 16 years old. So that by the time he's 18, 19, he's kind of, becoming the guitar player for the Apollo Theater house band. But it's really an amazing story. And it's about a 2-hour interview. If you can find, it's not that hard to find. But if you have any interest in music, in spirituality, and somebody who has just an incredible amount of self-awareness, I spent 2 hours for that interview. It's highly, highly entertaining, really entertaining. If you have any interest in David Bowie and 20th century music in general, you'll really enjoy the interview because he plays with a lot of people. He's played with a ton of people. And one of the first groups he played with was called The Main Ingredient. So some of you old heads out there. And then again, from the astrology, and what's interesting about Carlos Alomar as well is that he was born when Mercury was stationed. Like, it's really interesting to see people that are born Mercury retrograde, right, or Mercury direct. But Mercury station is a very unique transit in a person's chart. So he had that when he was born, and you can kind of hear it's in Aries, right? He's very clear, he's very direct, and then he has a very tight sextile to Venus and Gemini. So his interpersonal skills are really off the charts. Anyway, if you have any interest in music and an interesting personality who has some fascinating things to say, go check out Carlos Alomar. All right, let's see who we got in the chat tonight. We always got to give some love to Captaria. There's my man DJ MC. Oh, it is St. Patrick's Day, isn't it? Oh, St. Pat. No, I'd have to get in my Irish accent. I don't want to embarrass myself. I haven't had enough Guinness. There's my man Mark. Yes, what's going on, brother Mark? Good to see you. Glemma, hi Glemma. Glemma's here. There's my man T Jordan. Ryan, what's going on, Ryan? Trish Yamamoto, excited for tonight's AstroLive. Me too, Trish. Good to see you. Let's see, Healing Heart Rosie, so glad to be here. Had a rough week. A coworker proved to be a snake. There's a lot of snakes out there in the workplace. Lots of snakes. I've dealt with a few. I've dealt with a few boa constrictors in the workplace. Sorry to hear that, but we're glad you're here. And we have a lot of uncoiled scorpionic energy here, but I don't think this room is filled with snakes. Let's see, Orlando, Southwest Virginia, chiming in. The Coffee Queen is here. Peter Bio, what's up, Peter? Good to see you. DE Secom, Scientology. DE, you're not far off. I was getting sucked into the Scientology whirlpool with this fucking Jack Parsons, Ron Hubbard, Babalon Working thing it's fucking crazy, right? It's crazy. Do what you got to do. Thank you, Orlando. Appreciate that. Well, feed that dog and shower, Peter. We'll still be here. We'll be going through the greetings. Maybe by the time you get back, we'll be launching into the proceedings. From greetings to proceedings. Sue Leonard's here. Hello, Sue. Michael, you're funny. You're very funny. Jeff Rose and JR, what's happening? There she is, the lovely and talented one, Dr. Joan S. with us. The whimsical farm girl is here. What's up, Whimsy? Meow, meow. Neo, Mary Lee, Sweet Home, Alabama. What's going on, Mary Lee? Beth Berry, Susie, born in Fontana. By the way, chat on Friday was fucking exceptional. If you haven't seen Friday's show, the Friday show is great. With Alex Bolton from Crypto K, like really good show. Alex, mind blowing. But you guys in chat were just spinning and riffing and exchanging sources. It was really like a high level of just atoms ping-ponging across the screen in a positive sense. It was really good. Let's see, Monique Phoenix. What's happening, Monique? SP Dimples. SP, yes, she's already occupying March 18th. How is it? How's the future, SP? How's the future looking? News memorandum. That's JJ, in case you're not aware of it. What's going on, JJ? Misbehaving 2 is back with us. There's my man, WC Ray. What's going on, brother? Good to see you. Harriet Bowie. Hey. Letro, born in 1953, graduate high school 71. Cannot hear to wait. All about the 60s. You love the intro song. It kind of lopes, right? It's got kind of a loping feel. It lopes into the cosmos. Let's see. Jola, you are here. You're catching the light. Cynthia Cluth. Hi, Cynthia. The great Tondar is with us. Tondar. What's going on, Tondar? Hope you and the fam are doing well, and baby Tondar keeping you on your toes. Let's see. Jeff Gallant checking in from PEI Charlottetown in Canada. Jeff, we're glad you're with us tonight. Road Trip 81, Lisa T. Seguin, who is in Florida. Ain't gonna lie, Marjorie Cameron was a smoke show. She was a smoke show, and so was Northrop. Those guys were trafficking in hot rods, for sure. Barbara Boots, the 60s were my youth time. You are a boomer. We should just call you Barbara Boomer Boots. I mean that in only the best way, Barbara. Let's see. It was the pill. The pill played a huge part in it. Wasn't the only part, though. The pill was the unholy sacrament, wasn't it? Let's see. Who else do we have here? Bodhicitta, checking in from Middle West Ohio. Nice. Scott's saying good morning. So Scott must be in another part of the universe where the time is a little bit different. Well, good morning back to Scott. Scuba Kell's here with us. What's happening, Scuba Kell? Future Forecasters recently did a remote viewing of Marina Orsic. See, we got killed by the Soviet troops. Those fucking Soviets. Bastards. Gala Travelog. What's happening, Gala? Claire. Okay, yes. Here you are, Claire. Here we are. We're together. Was there an American eclipse in the late 60s? Not one of any note. Not one. The ones that so I did last week when I did the eclipse show. I went over the ones that were considered the most noteworthy. The one that really tripped me out was the one where somehow the scientists determined that by watching the eclipse and viewing the eclipse and coming up with some kind of mathematical formula of the eclipse, that it somehow proved Einstein's theory of relativity. Like where did that come from? And how exactly did those astronomers do that? How did they figure out that that eclipse validated Einstein's theory of relativity? And Einstein was basically a nobody before any of that. And now all of a sudden they're going, oh, yes, this man with this obscure theory, well, it's being proven out right here by this eclipse, which started in Washington State. It was kind of like a version of the eclipse that happened in 2017, which went basically from Oregon to Washington. Very similar. I thought that was really odd. That was odd. It was almost like, you know what's interesting about eclipses? They talk about eclipses being these fated moments. And people that are born on or around eclipses have fated lives, right? Like the most, I would say, well-known version of that would be Donald Trump, who was born on a lunar eclipse in the sign of Sagittarius. And it certainly feels like there are elements to Trump's life that are quite fated in some ways, which is different than destined. And the other thing that what I mean by fated, one could make a case that the election in 2016 seemed almost fated, right? And Hillary Clinton, who will show up in our story tonight, and in the timeline of the 1960s, and the Scarlet Woman plays a role in that sort of fated, what's the word I'm looking for? Selection of Donald Trump. The other thing with Trump, if you haven't noticed already, he's got a problem with women. He has a problem with women. And what is the moon? The moon is the feminine. And just look around, E. Jean Carroll, Fannie Willis, the gal from Southern New York, Letitia James. I mean, all these women, right? And what's also interesting now, and even earlier, like I remember, when was this? Might have been around 2017. Where was Saturn? I think Saturn was just starting to hit in Aquarius, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it was just starting to hit in Aquarius. That would have been what, 2020. So it must have been before that. I think it was 2017 or 2018, right around there. Omarosa, who was really tight with Trump, right? She was really tight with Trump. Then all of a sudden she like turns on him and, writes this salacious tell-all book. And I think it might have had to do with a Mars transit going through Trump's sixth house, which was work and Aquarius. And Omarosa, she's an Aquarian. Of course she's an Aquarian. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. But then if you look at Omarosa, and again, I'm not here to say that this is a particular type, because obviously I'll give you one example. But again, something really fated happened there. I'll give you one example. Well, I'll save that example for the counterexample. But if you look at Omarosa and you look at Fannie Willis and you look at Letitia James, right? What do they all have in common? They're all so-called Black African American women, right? And they all had Trump in their crosshairs. So what do we look at with an eclipse moon? It is a black moon. And again, I'm just making an observation, just an observation. I'm not saying that this is the way it is, and all black women are going to be haunted by, an eclipse moon, or they're going to haunt men because they're. No, I'm not saying that, but I'm just looking at a pattern here, right? Just a pattern, like 3 women, and most recently, Willis and James are, they're playing for keeps. And, where is all that happening? It's happening in a court of law. Which sign rules law? Sagittarius. So one could make a case that both Fannie Willis and Letitia James are representatives to some degree of Trump's eclipse moon in Sagittarius, like the dark moon. So it's an interesting discussion, but he's had problems with E. Jean Carroll, and that eclipse moon really came out during the presidency, right? And then you had the porn chick who apparently had the Nexium brand on her labia or whatever. Like, she came out, so he started to have all these problems with the women. E. Jean Carroll, right? That's all like eclipse moon stuff for Trump, and how that sort of faded. Now, I was born not long after an eclipse. I was born, I think my mother went into labor just as the eclipse was ending. So my mother went into labor on an eclipse. So I'm born one day after the eclipse. And that's on the autumnal equinox. And I have, it's so when you're born on an eclipse, there's a couple things that I think can be equally true. Like, if you're born on an eclipse, sometimes you are not wholly recognized or totally recognized, right? Like, even here on this channel, on YouTube, right? I was having this discussion with Ryan earlier today, and it feels like that this channel is shadow banned because of the amount of subscribers I have or don't have. So again, when you look at the theoretical idea of the eclipse, it's like, the shadow of the moon crosses the sun, so it's shadow banned, right? I mean, it could be translated in that way, that in some ways I'm not seen, right? Like, and that can happen on eclipses. Like, the person winds up not being seen. There's also kind of odd, sort of faded moments when somebody's born on an eclipse, where things can happen that can be very pivotal and kind of set up these life-changing moments, which I've had in my life, both mostly for the good, I would say, and even if they weren't, they ultimately turned out good. And I've also, through my work as an astrologer, found out that there are more people born on eclipses than not. Believe it or not, there are more people born on eclipses than not. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the eclipse is stimulating the birth process. That's my sense. Then there's also the pre-eclipse for both the moon and the sun inside the chart, which is a whole nother discussion. But yeah, we're coming into this eclipse energy, aren't we? You can almost start to feel it. All right, who else do we have here? I just saw an FB reel that said we're going to have 5 days of darkness starting with the eclipse. Is it up to 5 now? I heard it was 3. Do I hear 6? 6. 6 going once, 6 going twice, 6. We have 6 over in the corner. 6 days of darkness. Can I get a 7? 7, 7, 7. 7 go once, 7 go once, 7 go once, 7, 7. We have a 7. 7 days of a darkness with the eclipse. Could be. You better start listening to all the local municipalities telling you to stock up on 3 days of water. Make sure your cars are filled with gas. why the fuck are they talking about this now in this way? Is it because they know something? Is it because we're dealing with, the madding of the crowds, right? Is this a mass hysteria ritual? There's a lot going on here. Let's see, who else do we have? Oh, SP's hanging out in Luxembourg. Cool. I had a beer in Luxembourg one time. Let's see, Bowie guitarist. Yeah. It's a great interview, by the way. Peter loves Carlos. Dude, he's amazing. CC Jones, Fran's in the house. What's happening, Fran? The eclipse next month will be on the western side of Yes. Canada gets its fair share of the eclipse. Dan checking in from California, where I was born in the 60s. In an Aries. All right, Dan, welcome to the show. Green-eyed Crow. Love Bowie. What are days of darkness? Days of darkness is when, I guess you can't get the internet. And you can't play any online games. Those are the days of darkness. Let's see. What else do we have here? Julie Sunshine. Oh, no. Husband of 43 years is dying in the hospital. Please pray for him. We need a miracle. All right, Chataria. Let's rub our hands together here. Let's get it going. Let's get the energy up. Let's get it up. For Julie's husband. Come on. There you go, Julie. I gave it my best. A lot of friction. Let's see. Who do we have here? What else? Hojas Azules. Yeah, Julie. Take good care of that man. Do I think Kate is dead or alive? I don't think Kate lives here anymore. Let's see. Who else do we have? Heidi Smith. Hello, Heidi. The Kate thing is high stranged. Yes. Has Carlos played with Fall Paul? I don't know, Jay. He's played with a bunch of people. Did Robert discuss Macron's president of France is married to a transgender father? Discuss Macron's president of France. Are you talking about Macron's supposed wife? Or are we going 2 layers deep there? Cynthia brings it back to the cycles of our existence. I got to tell you, honestly, the whole trans thing doesn't really move my needle very much. Because, first of all, if you go back through history and you look at the various kings and queens, mostly queens, those are dudes. Those are fucking dudes. Like, was it Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen? Like, why do you think she was a Virgin Queen? She's probably a dude. So a lot of this goes on and has been going on for a very long period of time. And it wouldn't stop with royals, right? It would go right into statecraft and the so-called wives of these presidents. And you go back and look at some of these wives and Do you remember looking at Barbara Bush for the first time, right? Or at least becoming cognizant of Barbara Bush without the Crowley backstory? You're like, fuck, she's ugly, right? That's a fucking ugly woman. Jesus. He looks like a dude. Barbara Bush looks like a dude. I mean, how many of us had those conversations in our brains before we understood that that's what they do? Right? Like that's what they do. Then the question is, well, where did little Jebby and little Georgie, right, and the other bushy boy, where did they come from? That's a whole other discussion here, right? But you look at her and you go, man, she's fucking ass ugly. You would think that the director of the fucking CIA and this guy with all this money and all these connections can marry somebody a little, a little hotter than that. And then you go back and you look at a lot of these, well, dare I say, Michelle Obama fits into that category. Perhaps somewhat more aesthetically pleasing on some level than Barbara Bush. I mean, come on. Barbara Bush is a fucking bulldog, with silver hair. Then again, Michelle Obama, whatever kind of filters they worked with her later on, Michelle, but you can't not see that back, right? She's got a back as big as Mike Tyson. But do you know what I'm saying, right? Like, here we go. It's the same thing, right? So statecraft imitates aristocracy. Now, if you look at Pat Nixon, she looks a little boyish. She winds up looking better as she gets older. She was looking more feminine. I can tell you right now, Nancy Reagan was a chick. She was a chick. She had a reputation in Hollywood, which is one of the reasons why she wound up in the White House. Rosalynn Carter, probably a woman, but there are people who are convinced that Melania Trump's a dude, right? It has everything to do with the waist, facial structure. I think she's a chick. I think she's a woman. But there are people who will make the case that she's. There are all these other people. Jacinda Ardern. Jacinda Ardern. She got a little. She's a little dude. It's a dude like a lady. Dude like a lady walk, right? So I don't know. It doesn't really move the needle that much. Like, so what is the net effect, right? The net effect is, we've fooled you all for all these years, right? This is the first line of deception. And if you can't move past the first line of deception, then you're not worthy of understanding the mysteries of all the other deceptions that we have fed you all along the way. So maybe that's it. Maybe that's the first line of decoding. That's a dude. That's a dude. That's a dude. You've just been fucking with us the whole time. Right? Fucking with us the whole time. But then what? Then where do you go with that? Storm the castle walls, storm the palace walls. I mean, I don't know. But yeah, you look around and there's clearly a lot of gene switching going on. And of course, even in Hollywood, where for years people have been playing with these transvestigations. And it's one of those things that I think is interesting when you first get into it. It's kind of like, it's one of those red pill moments where you start to see and you go, what? They've been doing this the whole fucking time? Well, what else have they been doing? And I think that's the interesting part. Like, what else have they been doing? And I suppose that there's some kind of weird alchemical sort of dance that they're doing with, the barely made up androgyne, maybe some kind of weird alchemical ritual in all of this that us mere mortals just can't seem to understand. And I would say to that extent, thank God we don't. Let's see. Nan loves Bowie. Yes. Let's see. Catherine K. Double K's here. What's happening, Double K? Loving the background art tonight. Thanks, Moniz. It's also in the thumbnail. Rama Lama, what's happening? Rama's working on. So we're working on the newsletter coming out soon. For all you members, we're going to have a special eclipse debriefing. That's the newsletter. It's all private. That's a private meeting. Heidi Smith is here. St. Patty's Day back. Under Pressure may be the greatest tune ever, a spell breaker. Tavistock produced or not. It's a great song. Yeah, love that song. Let's see. JJ getting some love for her newest designs. Check out JJ. Rain de Blanc. Jeweler Deluxe. Canada, Prince Edward Island, going to over the west side of the island that day. Yes. I tracked some of the eclipse action through Canada. I think the last island is it St. Mary? St. Mary? I think St. Mary is the last island. That's the last part where the eclipse goes over North America. I think it's St. Mary Island. Don't quote me on it, but I think it is. Let's see. Cato. Hi, Cato. Jay Schiffler. Checking in from Tucson. Friday show was fabulous. Yeah. We've had some good ones, haven't we? The week before we had James Bartley. And not everybody agreed with James, and not everybody, liked what James had to say. But come on. It's going to start some conversations. Agree or not, right? And if anybody's going to go down, the ET rabbit hole, that's your dude. He's lived it. He studied it. Like, that's your guy, right? So the last 2 Fridays have been really excellent. Let's see. I always miss the badass chats. Well, it was a good chat. It was a very, very good chat. Grateful Dogs. What's happening? Catch up. Yes, was productive procrastination. Dimples, you're so funny. Productive procrastination. I would agree with that. Fellow Scorpio rising. Right on. Right on. Power to the pincer. I like that. Adams ping pong. Yes, that's what you are. You're Adams ping ponging in a super collider of information and interchange. Derek Reagan Walls. What's happening, Derek? Happy St. Patty's back. YouTube live chat isn't available for all anymore. Don't know if it is a platform thing. I don't. That's interesting. I was not aware of that. Not aware. Ziggurats. The inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. Little Marjorie Cameron reference there. Little Kenneth Anger. Barbara, you like that, huh? Barbara Boomer Boots. Triple B. I think that's a good one. Jimmer 233. What's happening? Late 60s, my birth time. So begins Gen X. Yes, Jay. You are an official member. Beach Barn, Sunday, wind down with Astro. I like that. Wind down, not wind down. Wind down with AstroLive. Here's to you. Tom DeRosa says, I'm Lord of the Wasteland. You are the Baron of the Bum. Let's see. Elizabeth Heron checking in. Hi from Japan. Maria Orsich was a knockout. I know. Wouldn't you love to have Maria Orsich as your sexy psychic girlfriend? Not only would you have beauty at your disposal, but you could probably get lottery predictions too. How is that not a win-win? Starting to watch today, Seattle Born here. Yeah, the the eclipse, what was it? What was that? 1921? Was that what it was? When they decided that they were going to use that eclipse to explain the theory of relativity. It started in Washington State. The last eclipse in 2017 started in Oregon, so it's kind of in the same area. Let's see. Robert Kennedy's born in eclipse as well, I believe. Again, totally like fated life. I wonder if it's a lunar eclipse because he's in trouble with women. Trouble with nobody wanted to look dumb, so they all agreed the eclipse provided the theory of relativity. It sounds like an inside job, doesn't it? Hey, let's just use this eclipse so we can validate Einstein. Let's just use it. Are you good with that? Yeah, I'm good with that. You come up with the formula. Just make it so abstract and arcane that nobody else can understand it. And they'll all just shake their heads and Einstein will be a big deal. All right, done. Christine Mose checking in from San Diego County. In my opinion, much of astronomy is smoke and mirrors. And no, I'm not a flat earther. Cynthia, I'd agree with you. I'd agree with you. Total eclipse. I can vouch for that. 1976, 79. Okay, there we go. Let's see. Fated stage, destined scripted. What else do we have here? Going through a Pluto opposition to my natal sun. It kind of sucks so far. Well, if that's how you describe it, it kind of sucks so far, then you're doing okay. You're doing okay. Pluto oppositions to the sun are they're not fun. They're not fun. The external world seems to have a real stranglehold on the life of the individual. And there's lots of endings involved. Lots of endings. And depending on what sign Pluto, so Pluto opposition your sun, so you're like an early Leo, is that right? Are you an early Leo? Yeah. Either early Leo, what are you, early Leo or late Cancer? If you're a late Cancer, then the Pluto opposition is gonna, man, that can, for those late Cancers with Pluto opposing their suns, that's a hard opposition. Really hard opposition. Because of the sensitive nature of Cancer, right? And the sort of that status brutality of Pluto in Capricorn. You know, if you were somebody who was late degrees Cancer, say, 23, 24, going through that Pluto opposition during COVID, that must have just been brutal. Brutal, brutal, brutal. If you have it going through Aquarius and you're a Leo, you're gonna probably see your friends pass away, right? Like your social groups, your friends, people that you're familiar with. So all you early degree Leo people, that's what you're going to start to witness. That's part of it. I think also it can work in the inverse. And we know Leo is connected to the ego, right? The ego, self with a capital S. All things good and bad, mighty and small, right? With Leo that go along with it. And there are two things that can happen. One, the Pluto Leo opposition. If you are a egotistical Leo, if you are a Leo with a neon billboard, the Pluto opposition can blow out a few bulbs. The other thing with the Pluto opposition, early degrees of Leo, is that in a lot of ways, the death of the identity is taking place. And there's a very interesting transposition between being somebody who is well known for something, or somebody who is identified with one thing, which is a lot of times that's what happens with Leo, right? And you have to die to that version of yourself and that version of Leo, because there's a higher octave with that, right? There's a higher octave and a higher expression that comes in that isn't really about self in that way, right? And at that point, what Leo has to do is step up and take on a leadership role, and a leadership role that is courageous, heartfelt, and consistent, right? Because that's the key to leadership, is consistency. So that's just on an individual level, but you could also begin to witness like the death of friends in your friends groups and social groups. That's part of it as well. Okay. But in any case, and that's also fixed, by the way. That's fixed. Women are offended by DT. Who's DT? What's DT? Let's see. Not this woman. I don't know what that's about. I don't know what that's about. Let's see. DJT becomes ripe in June. 78. The Epta-Octa theme. Satan has zero creativity. That's Lee coming in. June, the month of milk. Juno. Let's see. Whoa, my son was born 3 days before a solar eclipse. Pretty close. Yeah, close enough. Yep. Omarosa will always turn on you. It's like Trump never saw that an episode of his own show, right? I mean, that the thing with Omarosa always blew my mind. Like, how the fuck did he keep her around for so long? And then she had that weird quick marriage with Michael, what's his name, who was in the Green Mile. Omarosa is one of those women that could be a dude as well, right? John Bolton says he regrets trying with them. I think John Bolton was a pick of Sheldon Adelson's. I think Trump had to take him on. I think Trump only has problems with leftist women, my opinion. Maybe. Maybe. But they're still women. Let's see. Who else do we have? Oh, DT. Oh, I see. DT. DT's Donald Trump. There we go. Abraham's side chick, Hagar, begot Ishmael. Catherine Rosen's here. Trump birthed on a solar or lunar eclipse. We'll whip out the Trump chart later. We'll whip it out. Bandy's got a big fat moon. Ain't that the truth? Moonsprout. Hi, Moonsprout. They're entitled black women. If they did it right, it would make sense. They've been beguiled by power instead of self-respect. You know, we've talked about this before. Like I talked about this on a Sunday night show, where there seems to be, in kind of a proto-mythological sense, of the promotion of the likes of Fannie Willis and London Breed and Kamala Harris and Muriel Bowser and Letitia James, that it is a veneration of the Black Madonna, and the Black Madonna also being very much connected to Sophia. So there's this weird connection with like this outward manifestation of the Sapphic correction. This is what we've talked about here. So it goes something like this, that we have to experience the Sapphic correction if you are in the world of the Gnostic universe. And the most visible means and ways of initiating the Sapphic correction would be to, quote unquote, put Black women in positions of power and authority, right? But that would be the ultimate correction, which connects Black women to the Black Madonna, who has been connected to Sophia. And so there's this interesting intersection between, and you get the Imagine Star out of it, right? So you have the Black Madonna, who is the queen of the earth, and you have the inverted triangle. And then you have Mary Inanna, who's the queen of heaven. And then you have the triangle moving upwards. And so when they intersect, you have the Imagine Star. So we've talked about this before from like this alchemical or metaphorical point of view, that the employment and the empowerment and the rise of the so-called Black woman as an administrator of state is related to the Sapphic correction. Now, whether or not they all sat down and said, hey, let's work out the Sapphic correction and let's make Kamala Harris vice president, that should do it, right? Now, I don't know if they sat down and did that or not. But in a weird way, it kind of feels that way, right? Like that's the most kind of metaphorical, alchemical version of that relationship with the state and the administrators of the state and how they appear. And, you know, I mean, if you're looking at it from that perspective, it's much better than saying, well, they just hired the absolutely least qualified people to do the most qualified jobs. At least the other one has a bit of metaphysical, you know, shine on it, right? But that's, you know, we've gone down that path. And I think there's to some degree, there's some truth in there, right? To some degree, there's some truth in it. Okay, if we, you know, it's kind of like, if we elevate, and by the way, I got into a kind of a Twitter back and forth months ago, which I talked about, with this woman who was your typical white liberal lefty from Berkeley. And we were going back and forth on policy, and I was trying to get her to understand that there were much bigger forces at play. And of course, they never want to go there. They want to get basically, you know, cause specific or action specific. Well, it's much bigger than you understand. But anyway, after we kind of parted ways, she says to me in Twitter, well, thank you. And I hope you join me in assisting Black women to take the reins of power and change the world we're living in, because they're the only ones that are capable, something along those lines. I swear this is what she was saying, right? So there's something to what I'm talking about, because clearly enough people on a certain side of the political spectrum are invested in that, right? And when you have such a powerful response or pull, usually what's at the root of that is it's either mythological or archetypal. Because if it doesn't have those roots, then it goes away rather quickly, right? So we're trying to get to the beneath the surface of the iceberg. You know, we just see, you know, Fannie Willis and Letitia James and blah blah blah. But what's beneath the surface? This is what we've gotten into a bit here. So it's an interesting topic of conversation. It's not going to show up tonight as much. when we get into the 60s, which we probably should. All right. Why don't we catch up here? We're good, right? We're good. Thanks for being here. We're an hour in. Did a lot of meet and greet and chat. So thank you all for being here. All right. So let's get into the topic. Why are we talking about this tonight? Well, how I got to tonight's topic is it's quite roundabout in some ways. I've been watching hours and hours of video of Richard Nixon on YouTube for the past 2 weeks. And one of the main sources of the video that I've been consuming of Nixon came from a 36-hour interview he did with this guy, Frank Gannon. And this is, I think, from the 80s, if I'm not mistaken. Nixon still has his wits about him. Nixon had his wits about him all the way to the end. He was very sharp. And you really get into a detailed story of Nixon and where he came from, where he grew up, and his rise to ultimately the president of the United States, with a lot of interesting challenges along the way. And this is just some aside. Now, Nixon, of course, is a Capricorn, so you have to keep that in mind. He's a Capricorn. He's got Moon in Aquarius. I think he might have Mercury in Sag, if I'm not mistaken. We might even well take a look at Nixon's chart at some point. But there's a lot of incredible stories that go along with Nixon. And at one point, he was going up against this woman named, what was it, Helen Cahagan something. She was a formidable opponent in California, and I think it was it Nixon's senatorial bid or something like that. And old man Kennedy came in and gave Nixon $1,000. This is before Nixon and Kennedy squared off as president. That's a pretty big contribution back in the, I believe, the 1950s, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, that would have been the 60s, post running for president. That was Nixon's interim. Helen Cahagan Douglas, I think her name is. So Kennedy's old man and Kennedy and Nixon all shared something similar. They all hated communism, ironically enough. And Cahagan Douglas was definitely on the left side. She was a lefty. So they wanted to make sure that she wasn't going to get in, and Nixon could continue his anti-communist crusade, which started during the House of Un-American Activities, where he personally investigated Alger Hiss and wound up really turning the tables on Alger Hiss and exposing him and his network, by the way. Nixon was a bulldog when it came to research and facts. So you learned a lot of these interesting things about Nixon in this interview, or these interviews. And but then I started to see a number of different other clips of Nixon. There was one where he was on the 1968 campaign trail, and he was in Atlanta, Georgia. And you wouldn't see this anymore with presidential candidates, where they are in a live setting with people who ask them questions, and the questions are not known ahead of time. They're not known ahead of time. And Nixon just gets to kind of riff on the question. He was great. He was absolutely great. And even the more salacious stuff, right? Like the private phone calls, which you can find on YouTube. And he has this really interesting series of phone calls with Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And the Moynihan study talks about the challenges around Black America in the United States during that time. And it's a very kind of gripping, very real, honest sort of appraisal as to what's going on, because Nixon inherits a country that's on fire, right? He inherits the country where they have in 1967, the riots in Detroit, in how they have the fires. I mean, they were happening all over the place. The Watts riots, you name it. I mean, this is coming, off the heels of the civil rights movement and the death of Martin Luther King, which ultimately happens in 1968 as well, right? So Nixon inherits all of this. So he's trying to understand it, and he's trying to figure out what to do. Like, he's trying to figure out what to do. How do we close this gap, right? How do we live in a more healthy and integrated country? So I got to give him props for going into areas that probably would have made other presidents a bit uncomfortable, right? Because you can hear it on these phone calls, and he's very candid, but not in a bad way, though, not in a insulting or demeaning way, just in a fact-finding, exploratory way. And Nixon has this incredibly positive vision of America in the 1960s. It's incredibly positive. And one of the things that comes out of this series of interviews and clips is somebody, I think it might have been Gannon, I forget, I think it was Gannon, what's the most important thing that a president needs to have? It's a really important question. And Nixon says, well, I'll tell you what it is. You can go to college and you can go through all the poli-sci courses, and they'll tell you need this, and 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 you don't need any of those. What you need is a great cause. You need a great cause, and you need something to believe in, and you yourself have to believe in it, because if you don't believe it, nobody else is going to believe in it. And you need to get other people to believe in it and be a part of that cause. So, of course, Roger Stone was an apprentice to Nixon when Nixon was in office. And this is ultimately where Trump gets Make America Great Again. It's from Roger Stone. It's from Nixon through Roger Stone. And you can see that Nixon is trying to sculpt. He's trying to take the best elements of America, which, for all intents and purposes, you can see for about 8 years, from 1952 to 1960, during the Eisenhower administration, right? Like, that is peak America in a lot of ways. So Nixon, who served under Eisenhower as his vice president, is essentially trying to take the best of that, combine that with his own experience in World War II, because he was a soldier in World War II. He's part of the Great Generation. It comes out of that, and they all come out of it with a sense of victory. And, we've done our share, and the world is a safer place and a better place, blah, 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 right? Thrown a little bit of founding fathers in the Constitution. And this is what shapes Nixon's consciousness and also his grasp of history in general. And so what he's trying to do here in the 60s is give America their version of Make America Great, but not again. And he's thrown into this time where it's almost impossible for him, and the tides of the time, that it's impossible for him to be able to turn the ship around. And in fact, he suffers the most disgraceful of indignities. He's impeached, but prior to his impeachment, he resigns, so they can't impeach him. And looking back on what were thought to be his impeachable offenses, well, quite frankly, they're like taking, I don't know, they're like taking diapers from Walgreens now, based upon what happened. You look around and you look at the corruption and what the current administration is involved in. Are you kidding me? Richard Nixon in Watergate makes him coming. He looks like a fucking choir boy, right? And there are other reasons why that happened. I don't want to get, stuck in the weeds around it, but it's a turning point for the country and not a good one. He's a Capricorn. And what did America want to do during that time? What did they want to do during that time? They wanted to kill the father. That's what was on the minds and the unspeakable bloodlust in the hearts of many young Americans. It was the death of the father, right? Now, if you look at what we're dealing with here, mostly Pluto and Leo, boomers. If you were born in 1947, right? By the time 1974 rolls around, you're almost hitting your Saturn return. And remember, people in their 20s back in the 60s and the 70s were much older than they are now. But you could even look at people in their late teens and early 20s. And we have everything that's related to like what's happening on the campuses across America. They want to basically hang the dean. They want to hang the provost, right? This happened in California. They had S.I. Hayakawa who stepped in and basically said, fuck you, I'm bringing in the troops, go back to school, right? But there was that sentiment across America. It was the killing of the father. And Pluto in Leo, and Leo's the sun, and Leo's the father in the chart until the child reaches the age of 7. And at that point, the father takes on the role of Saturn in the chart. Why is that? Because when you're a little kid, you're a baby, what do dads do? They play with you, they get on the ground, they wrestle, they roll, they make funny faces, right? And at a certain point in time, like you can't be doing that shit anymore, right? You like now have a child to raise, right? And so the shift from Saturn, so from the sun to Saturn takes place, and it's at that first Saturn square at 7, right? So we know that Capricorn and Saturn play a role in the development of a child. You go to the Saturn opposition at 14, and again, it's Saturn. It's Saturn, the ruler of Capricorn, and that's when the child separates out from family, separates out from the father, right? It's that Saturn opposition, the first one, the one that says, I need to be defined by my own music, my own clothes, my own habits, whatever they are. And sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's not such a good thing. But again, it's Saturn. So Saturn is playing a role this entire time in our relationship with our fathers in time, in culture. And eventually, what does Saturn become? Saturn becomes the boss. You're not on time. You're late, right? Like the boss is the timekeeper. He said, "You're late again. We're not getting a full day's work out of you. We're gonna have to penalize you if you don't show up. You're gonna lose your job." Right? That's Saturn. I'm not here to make your schedule. I'm here to make sure that you keep it. If you don't keep it, we won't keep you. I mean, it comes down to something like that. That's Saturn. And so Nixon's a Capricorn. And he's ripe for the picking. Right? Like Nixon becomes America's wicker man. Trump, very close to becoming America's wicker man. It's a different story. But Nixon became America's wicker man. He's a Capricorn. And we're dealing with this generation, this Pluto and Leo. Now, we're going to mention right in here Jim Morrison. Right? Jim Morrison, whose father is a saturnine figure. He's Douglas Morrison. He's the admiral. He's the fucking admiral of the Pacific Fleet in Vietnam. And he's there, right, in the Gulf of Tonkin. But it all starts. So not only does Morrison have a Saturnian figure, i.e. a father, he's got one that's a fucking commander. Like, how Saturn does that get? And what do we know about Jim Morrison? He's going to come back into our story here. What do we know about Jim Morrison? Jim Morrison writes a song called The End. And what does he do? What does he do? He acts out. He acts out this ancient ritual, right? This ancient ritual where ultimately at the end of the song he says, Mother, Father, I want to kill you. And then he screams, and Mother, I want to, and he goes into the intonation of I want to fuck you, right? Never completes it, but everybody knows that that's what it's all about, right? And that's Morrison. This is what he's singing. It is an invocation. The end is an invocation to kill the father. That's what it is. That's what it is. And what happens? By 1974, they've got the fathers in the crosshair. It's Nixon. He's a wicker man. It's a sacrificial moment. And the forces of darkness and chaos and ultimately Dionysus have won. Jim Morrison was a channel of Bacchus Dionysus. This is what Morrison was all about. The expression of the Dionysian act. Jim Morrison is not Apollonian. Not even close. His father might be, but not Jim Morrison. And so Jim Morrison becomes this high priest of the Dionysian cult. And the 60s are, for all intents and purposes, the Dionysian cult. And where does it start? That's the question, right? Where does it start? So, I think you have to go back to Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard when they did what's called the Babalon Working. And they did the Babalon Working. Okay, so if you don't know what the Babalon Working, let me give you some background. A lot of you guys already know this because you're really sharp in general, but L. Ron Hubbard was basically told by naval intelligence to start spying on Jack Parsons, who was in the Navy, because they found him to be a rather peculiar fellow doing rather peculiar things. And L. Ron Hubbard saw that Jack Parsons was a magician. And he was, at that time, in fairly close correspondence with Aleister Crowley. So Jack Parsons was the head of the OTO and the head of the Thelemites in America. So he is literally a working magician. So he's working on sigils, invocations, circles, and then some. Of course, L. Ron Hubbard thinks this is incredibly fascinating. And it's a lot more fascinating than just spying on him. By the way, he and Robert Heinlein were both in naval intelligence at that time. And he and Heinlein would both go on to become science fiction writers, because that was another side gig of L. Ron Hubbard, who, of course, is famous for writing Battlefield Earth which is sort of the fictional spine in a lot of ways of Scientology, if you follow the threads. Heinlein and Hubbard, of course, knew each other, and they had a bet, and they bet each one to see who could start their own, who'd be the first to start their own religion. Clearly, it was L. Ron Hubbard. Not that Heinlein wasn't trying. I mean, I think he wrote "Stranger in a Strange Land" with the idea that somehow that could spark some kind of spiritual or religious awakening, and that maybe somehow he can magically transpose himself into Mike, who is the lead character of that story. But that doesn't really happen. It falls on Hubbard's shoulders, right? So Hubbard hangs out with Jack Parsons, and he gets involved with a lot of the shenanigans that are going on eventually when Parsons leaves the Navy, and he has this this mansion in LA where he sets up like 19 different bungalows, and basically he creates a magical community in Los Angeles. So these people who are interested in things like magic, in the esoteric, in the occult, they wind up going to this place, right? And L. Ron Hubbard's there with him, and that's where they do a lot of this stuff, right? They eventually do their this thing called the Babalon Working at this compound that that Jack Parsons has developed, right? He's basically just subdivided a bunch of rooms. And what's interesting is that as soon as Parsons winds up leaving that property, it's completely leveled, and then something else is built there. I think it was adjacent to the August Bush mansion. So the guy that started Anheuser-Busch was like right next door to Jack Parsons and all of his little thelemites. So they wind up doing this. And the way this all happens is quite unusual. And we're going to get to the we're going to get to the story here, right? We're going to get to the story here very quickly of the Babalon Working. So I want to go into the players because there's key players. All right. So one of the key players is Sarah Northrop Hollister. Let me show you what we have here. So this is Sarah Northrop Hollister, and she's born April 8th, 1924, Pasadena, California. And then she dies eventually at the age of 73 in Hadley, Massachusetts. So she plays a fairly significant role because you can see that these guys are into like summoning, like they're summoning women and forces. It feels to me like L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons are like the reincarnation of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. That's what it feels like. Whether they are or not, that's what it feels like. Because that's a lot of what Brigham Young and Joseph Smith did was they hustled women, right? And clearly there are these deeply magical elements inside of Mormonism that probably made a lot of these women very attracted to whatever it is they were selling. So let's get, this is really interesting how she gets there. It all starts with her sister, Helen. I'm going to read this. It's also interesting that Northrop is also the name of one of the largest defense manufacturers in this country, Northrop Grumman, right? So it's interesting. Like you've got some of these names, even Marjorie Cameron, who we're going to encounter. You know, you'll run into Ewing Cameron. right? Who's the guy who starts this crazy thing up at McGill University in Canada. And of course, you have James Cameron here in United States, right? Filmmaker, Alien, Aliens rather, not Alien, Aliens, Terminator, right? Like that James Cameron. And then you have like Duncan Cameron, who's part of the Philadelphia experiment. So there's all these kind of unusual iterations of the name Cameron. And they all seem to be connected to this very kind of cinematic and esoteric, dark, occult world. Psychic driving was created by Ewan Cameron in McGill University in Canada. So let's go through this a little bit. In 1933, Northrop's 22-year-old sister, Helen, met the 18-year-old Jack Parsons, a chemist who went on to be a noted expert in rocket propulsion. Jack Parsons was also an avid student and practitioner of the occult. Helen and Jack were engaged in 1934 and married in 1935. It always astounds me that these people who are occultists and esotericists get married. Like, what is that about? And they get married with marriage certificates, and the state gets involved. I mean, I don't know. I find it weird, but they get married anyway. Parsons' interest in the occult led in 1939 to him and Helen joining the Pasadena branch of the OTO. At age 15, Northrop moved in with sister Helen and her husband Jack while she finished high school. Parsons had subdivided a house, a rambling mansion next door to the estate of Adolphus Bush, which later became the first Bush Gardens, into 19 apartments, which he populated with a mixture of artists, writers, scientists, and occultists. Her parents not only knew about her unconventional living arrangements, but supported Parsons' group financially. Isn't that interesting? Northrop joined the OTO in 1941 at Parsons' urging and was given the title of Soror Sister Cassip. She soon rose to the rank of a second-degree member or magician of the OTO. In June 1941, at the age of 17, she began a passionate affair with Parsons, while her sister Helen was away on vacation. She made a striking impression on the other lodgers. George Pendle describes her as feisty and untamed, proud and self-willed. She stood 5'9", had a lithe body and blonde hair, was extremely candid. Remember, she's an Aries. Keep that in mind. She's an Aries. When Helen returned, she found Northrop wearing Helen's own clothes. So she comes back from her little vacation or whatever. Her sister is wearing her clothes, and she calls herself Parsons' new wife. Such conduct was expressly permitted by the OTO, which followed Crowley's disdain of marriage. Well, why the fuck did you get married? Is it because you had to break the bond? Is that why you got married? I mean, the whole thing is weird. As a detestable institution. But it's not the last time Jack Parsons would get married, by the way. And accepted as commonplace the swapping of wives and partners between OTO members. Although both were committed OTO members, Northrop's usurpation of Helen's role led to conflict between the two sisters. The reactions of Parsons and Helen towards Northrop were markedly different. Of course they were. Parsons told Helen to her face that he preferred Northrop sexually. This is a fact that I could do nothing about. I am better suited to her temperamentally. We get on well. Your character is superior. You are a greater person. I doubt she would face what you have with me or support me as well. Some years later, as addressing himself as you, Parsons told himself that his affairs with Northrop, whom he called Betty, marked a key step in his growth as a practitioner of magic with an ICK. Betty served to effect a transference from Helen at a critical period. Now, keep that in mind. What is he talking about? He's talking about energy and energy bodies. So he is working on this principle of the embodiment of two women in one, right, through Northrop. And this goes on even more. Your passion for Betty also gave you Hugh Bean Parsons. Your passion for Betty also gave you Betty, who's not Helen, the magical force needed at the time. And the act of adultery, tinged with incest, meaning that they were sisters, served as your magical confirmation in the law of Thelema. So what Parsons is doing is he's using this as a magical act on the left-hand path, right? That he's actually gaining something out of what other people would feel guilt, anxiety, all the normal kind of human reactions. He's inverting that and he's using that as power, right? As power. And then the thing with them being sisters is important as well. But the main part is the magical force, right? Keep that in mind. Helen was far less sanguine, writing in her diary, the sore spot I carried where my heart should be, and had furious, sometimes violent rows with both Parsons and Northrop. She began an affair with Wilfred Smith, Parsons' mentor in the OTO, and had a son in 1943 who bore Parsons' surname, but who was almost certainly fathered by Smith. Northrop also became pregnant, but had an abortion on April 1st, 1943. Again, there's that Aries date, arranged by Parsons and carried out by Dr. Zachary Taylor Malaby, a prominent Pasadena doctor and a Democratic politician. So eventually what happens is that Northrop meets up with L. Ron Hubbard. In August 1945, Northrop met L. Ron Hubbard for the first time. He had visited 1003 South Orange Grove Avenue at the behest of Lou Goldstone, a well-known science fiction illustrator. While on leave from his service in the U.S. Navy, Parsons took an immediate liking to Hubbard. Now, Hubbard, the story is that they knew each other in the Navy. That's another part of the story. After beginning affairs with one girl after another in the house, right? Hubbard soon began an affair with Northrop after beginning affairs with one girl after another in the house. So eventually, he's plowing through all the women in the OTO community there, and then he gets to Northrop, right? He was a striking figure who habitually wore dark sunglasses and carried a cane with a silver handle, the need for which he attributed to his wartime service. As Northrop later put it, he was not only a writer, but he was the captain of a ship that had been down in the Pacific, and he was weeks on a raft and had been blinded by the sun, and his back had been broken. She believed all of it, though none of his claims of wartime action or injuries were true, which is total Hubbard, by the way. Parsons was dismayed, but tried to put on a brave face on the situation, informing Crowley. So here we go. This is where we get into the Babalon Working. Hubbard became Parsons' magical partner for a sex magic ritual that was intended to summon an incarnation of a goddess. Although they got on well as fellow occultists, tensions between the two men were apparent in more domestic settings. Hubbard and Northrop made no secret of their relationship. Another lodger at Parsons' house described how he saw Hubbard living off Parsons' largesse and making out with his girlfriend right in front of him. Sometimes the two of them were sitting at the table together. The hostility was almost tangible. Despite the tensions between them, Hubbard, Northrop, and Parsons agreed at the start of 1946 they would go into business together, buying yachts on the East Coast and sailing them to California to profit. Well, eventually, Hubbard and Northrop split. They get 10 grand from Jack Parsons. They buy a boat, and they never bring it back. They never bring it back, right? So what happens is Parsons, Hubbard, and Northrop form the trio for the Babalon Working. So Sarah Northrop Hollister, becomes the vestibule for their sex magic ritual, the Babalon Working. So what is the Babalon Working? Well, it's a good question. So we're going to talk about it. The Babalon Working started, there we go. The Babalon Working started in, get the chart up here. Get the chart. Get up here. It was basically a 3-month process. So let me just put this up here. So this is towards the tail end of Hubbard and Parsons' relationship together. So the Babalon Working starts in January of 1946. Basically goes on for 3 months. And what they were doing, again, theoretically, is they were trying to do 2 things. One, which was to bring the spirit of Babalon into the world. That's what they were trying to do. The spirit of Babalon. Babalon is the Scarlet Woman. Babalon is also uniquely connected to the Gnostics. And the Gnostics even have a prayer, a Gnostic prayer to Babalon. So what they would do is they would create this magical circle, which all rituals are supposed to take place in, right? And they would, over time, remember, this is about a 3-month period from January through March of 1946. They would use Helen Northrop as the channel, right, to bring in what's called a moonlet. Some would say an inorganic being, or the spirit of like an egregore, where they were summoning an egregore, and that egregore would be Babalon itself, the Scarlet Woman. So how they would do this would be a combination of incantation, sleep deprivation, and sexual stimulation, right? That they would go through these like extended periods of keeping Helen Northrop on the verge of hypnagogia, right? That was their goal. Their goal was to keep her in a suspended state that wasn't asleep, but also wasn't awake. And it was through this kind of permeable, sort of interdimensional space that they would summon Babalon, the Scarlet Woman, the spirit, quote unquote, of the times, right? And or the zeitgeist of the time. So this would go on, and apparently they would drink wine. There'd be some flute playing. I mean, the notes that were sent. Curly was furious at the whole thing. So they do this for 3 months, right? During this time. And eventually, Hubbard and Helen leave. They split. Now, this is the chart that I pulled from March 4th, 1946, which would have been probably towards the end of what they were doing. I was trying to understand, like, well, what's going on here? Like, what are the astrological elements that they're playing with? Well, first of all, we know that Saturn was in Cancer during this time. So it was in Cancer starting in January. Now, when they started the quote unquote Babalon working, the true node was also in Cancer because we know that the nodes move backwards, right? So they were hip to astrology because if they were going to invoke a moon child, right, you would take advantage of the true node in the sign of Cancer if you were using plastic astrology. So this would have clearly been in Cancer in January, and it would have been, I don't know, somewhere in the first decan of Cancer. What's really interesting about these degrees, right? Like this is roughly the degree of where the true node in Gemini was when COVID started. And it could be just, a strange synchronicity, right? But remember, COVID starts right after the NFL draft in a big way. Like the NFL draft is happening during COVID. Like it's happening during COVID. We're home for 2 weeks. 2 weeks to stop the spread. It was much longer than 2 weeks. They have the NFL draft and they're beaming it from the homes of coaches and general managers. And that's when you knew the true node was in Cancer. Like they're doing the fucking NFL draft from home. And that's where you saw Bill Belichick and his dog basically making his little draft picks like he's drafting the fucking fantasy football team. And then right after that, the nodes shift. And we go into this very fractious time, which is what happens in 2020. Right. So that's just an interesting kind of side note. But if you go back to January, that node's going to be right about there in Cancer. We know Saturn is in Cancer as well during that period. And this day, which would have been towards the end of their, maybe even the consecration of the Babalon working, would have been with Mars conjoining with Saturn. And Mars being the creative principle, right? And then you have this, very interesting inversion with Saturn being the ruler of Capricorn in the sign of the moon, right? So it's like highly charged. And again, I would say even esoterically has a great deal of meaning because you're dealing with opposite forces and opposite energy, which in a lot of ways has some very intense kind of occult energy and power, right? So there's this interesting kind of commingling here with the moon and Saturn and Mars as the creative principle. Now, again, this would have been closer to the culmination point, right? So sometime in March, we don't know when. That's when they stopped. So I chose March 4th for a specific reason, which I'm going to show you in a minute here. So it's, I think, a very important day for a number of very interesting reasons. All right, so that's March 4th. We see where it started with the true node in Cancer. We're dealing with the conception of the moon child or the moonlet, the inorganic being, right? Which ultimately Hubbard and Parsons, are ultimately going to name that Babylon and the Scarlet Woman. Now, the question is, were they successful at doing this? I'm going to give you a bit of a side story that goes back to Hubbard and it goes back to Parsons. And in some ways, I'm going to, not that I'm here to promote, their brand of magic or practice, but it's clear that at one point it actually worked. And I'm going to show you, I'll give you an example of that here, which is why the Babalon Working might actually have some credence. Okay. So basically, these two, there's Northrop and Hubbard, they take off. They buy this yacht in Florida. They have no intention whatsoever of sailing back to California and doing this yacht business. So he's swindling Jack Parsons. So here we go. This is where it gets interesting. As you may know, by this time, Brother John, who is Jack Parsons, signed a partnership agreement with this Ron and Betty, whereby all money earned by the three for life is equally divided by the three. As far as I can ascertain, Brother John has put in all of his money. Meanwhile, Ron and Betty have bought a boat for themselves on Miami for about $10,000 and are living the life of rightly, while Brother John is living at rock bottom. And I mean rock bottom. It appears they never secretly intended to bring this boat around to the California coast to sell at a profit, as they told Jack, but rather to have a good time on it on the East Coast. Germer informed Crowley, this is through Crowley, who wrote back to opine, it seems to me on the information of our brethren in California, that Parsons has got an illumination in which he has lost all of his personal independence. From our brother's account, he has given away both his girl and his money. Apparently, it is the ordinary confidence trick. Parsons initially attempted to obtain redress through magical means, carrying out a banishing ritual. Now, this is interesting because it doesn't sound like it was unsuccessful. It is the banishing ritual, the pentagram, to curse Hubbard and Northrop. He credited it with causing the couple to abort an attempt to evade him. Hubbard attempted to escape me by sailing at 5 p.m. I performed a full evocation to Bartzabel, the spirit of Mars or war, within the circle at 8 p.m. So remember, this is how they did all their shit, right? Conjuring circles. At the same time, so far as I can check, his ship was struck by a sudden squall off the coast, which ripped off his sails and forced him back to port, where I took the boat into custody. Here I am in Miami pursuing the children of my folly. They cannot move without going to jail. However, I'm afraid that most of the money has already been dissipated. Northrop later recalled that the boat had been caught in a hurricane in the Panama Canal, damaging it too badly to be able to continue the voyage to California. Parsons subsequently resorted to more conventional means of obtaining redress and sued the couple on July 1st in the Circuit Court of Dade County. His lawsuit accused Hubbard and Northrop of breaking the terms of their partnership. Hubbard's relation with Northrop, while legal, had already caused alarm among those who knew him. Virginia Heinlein, the wife of the science fiction writer Robert Heinlein, regarded Hubbard as a very sad case of a post-war breakdown, and Northrop as his latest man-eating tigress. So the reason I brought that up is because apparently Parsons basically cast a spell on him, right, and fucked them up. So if that's true, there seems to be some legitimacy to their occult practice. Now, again, I am not condoning this. I'm not saying, hey, go run out and cast yourself a circle and start doing this. No, I'm not condoning this at all. What I'm trying to do is to establish this basis and grounds for the what I would call the unfortunate efficacy of the Babalon working. All right. So what comes out of this is Marjorie, well, the woman who would be known as Marjorie Parsons, and who would become Jack Parsons' paramour for a fair amount of time until Jack Parsons actually mysteriously dies. So let's take a look at her. Let's take a look at Marjorie for a minute. Now remember, Sarah Northrop Hollister, right? She's the one that has the tryst initially. Let me see. She's the one that has the tryst initially with Parsons and Hubbard. Okay. So let's get into Marjorie, who is an important figure here. All right. By the way, this is from the Gnostic Mass. This is what I was talking about. Babylon, let's see, where is it? The prayer of the Gnostic Mass. Where is it? With the, here we go. Here, let's make sure I show this to you. Okay. Within the Gnostic Mass, Babylon is mentioned in the Gnostic Creed. And it goes like this: and I believe in one earth, the mother of us all, and in one womb wherein all men are begotten, and wherein they shall rest. Mystery of mystery, her name is Babylon, right? That is the Gnostic Mass. And then here, Babylon is identified with Bina on the Tree of Life, the sphere that represents the Great Sea, and such mother goddesses as Isis, Bhavani, Ma'at. So she's the mother of all mothers, right? That's exactly what is being said here. Babylon, the great mother, represents matter. It goes on and on and on and on. So what happens, of course, you have these other magicians, Dee and Kelly, just like Parsons and Hubbard, who are into the invocation. And then we have the Scarlet Woman, right? And Crowley makes the connection between Babylon and the Scarlet Woman. Says, although Crowley often wrote that Babylon and the Scarlet Woman are one, there are also many instances where the Scarlet Woman is seen more as a representative of a physical manifestation of the universal feminine principle. So Crowley gets into that as well. And there are these individual Scarlet Women that show up in, oh, fuck. We got a freeze here. Son of a bitch. All right, I'll be right back. I'll be right back. We almost always get one freeze, don't we? All right, let's get back here. So these are all the women that Crowley had attributed the title the Scarlet Woman as. So again, so this is where we get into the Babalon Working with Parsons and Hubbard. So what happens is that Marjorie Cameron enters Jack Parsons' life. So he believes that Marjorie Cameron, Parsons Kimmel, is the manifestation of the Scarlet Woman, because she shows up after they leave. And what's interesting is that she's born on April 23rd. So she's right at the beginning of Taurus. And she is redheaded, right? This woman is a force. Marjorie Cameron is a force. And he sees her as being that manifestation, right? Like his magical working has come back to him. And she is this very interesting figure. And an artist. She shows up in a bunch of movies. She becomes connected with Kenneth Anger, Curtis Harrington. She winds up connected with Anton LaVey, right? There's Jack Parsons. So she has her own sort of occultic and esoteric kind of life that she lives. And eventually, of course, Parsons dies. And then she has her own sort of trajectory through the world. But she's kind of celebrated along the way. It has some very interesting connections with people. In fact, she went AWOL when she was in the armed services, and she wound up getting a honorable discharge, which she probably shouldn't have. And there's connections with her and Jack Parsons and her father and brothers at JPL. So again, it's this really strange kind of amalgam of characters, but she shows up on the heels of the Babalon Working, right? So it says this: unbeknownst to Cameron, Parsons had just finished a series of rituals using Enochian magic with his friend and lodger L. Ron Hubbard, all with the intent of attracting an elemental woman to be his lover. Upon encountering Cameron, with her distinctive red hair and blue eyes, Parsons considered her to be the individual whom he had invoked. After they met at the parsonage on January 18th, parsonage, they were instantly attracted to each other and spent the next 2 weeks in Parsons' bedroom together. Although Cameron was unaware of it, Parsons saw this as a form of sex magic that constituted part of the Babalon Working, a right to invoke the birth of the Thelemite goddess Babylon onto earth in human form. So he was continuing the Babalon Working once Marjorie shows up. I don't think he told her, but that's what he's doing, right? So she becomes the object of this summoning. And she is the Scarlet Woman with this flaming red hair and blue eyes, right? So it's interesting. Like, like he worked something and it came back to her. But was that all he worked? Did it stop at the emergence of Marjorie Cameron out of the ether? I don't think so. I think something happened with these two characters, with Sarah Northrup, and then perhaps even Marjorie Cameron herself, that invoked a spirit into the century that would dominate the 1960s. This is what we're getting at here, right? This is why the 60s become Dionysic. All right. What happens on March 4th, 1964? You probably don't know, but I'm gonna show you. Let's do this. On March 4th, 1964, it is the emergence of Scarlet the Witch in X-Men number 4. Or I'm sorry, this is March 4th. And X-Men. Right? So the debuts on March 4th. And I think this might even be X-Men number 4. So here you go. This is the X-Men. We're very early into the old X-Men series. And this is Magneto, whom, of course, you've seen played in the movie. But what's his name? Fucking Gandalf. And this originally is Scarlet the Witch, looking very un-Scarlet the Witch-like. But in later manifestations, she looks like this. Right here. Looking very more scarlet-y. And in this depiction of Scarlet the Witch, looking even more scarlet-y than that, right? Like here, it almost appears as if she has horns protruding from her flowing red locks. Like here, she does appear to be the image of the whore of Babylon. Wasted on a fucking android too, right? Wasted on a fucking android. That's the Vision, by the way. Eventually the guy that she'll wind up marrying, whatever that's about, who has some other spirit in him, right? He's like this, I don't know, hybrid android. But this is Scarlet the Witch, right? This is the Lady in Red. And so we have this emergence in popular fiction. And of course, it doesn't stop there, right? If I'm not mistaken, could be wrong. Let me just make sure about this. Let me see. Yeah, I was looking at Lolita. Yeah, black and white, so we wouldn't know. However, if you look at the poster for Lolita, the whole concept of the woman in red. Remember, this is from 1962, and we're talking about the movie, of course, directed by Stanley Kubrick. That's the poster for Lolita, and we just see the red spectacles around the eye, right, and the red lipstick and the red tongue. So even though we don't see the entirety of her in red, right, Lolita is another example of the Lady in Red, in which case she's a much, much younger example. There's the red sunglasses, the frame of Lolita, right? Okay, let's go back to that. So this is interesting. Like, to me, this is one of those images that emerges from the collective unconscious. This character Scarlet the Witch. We've had Scarlet O'Hara, who's another lady in red, another manifestation of Babylon, right? Scarlet. We have Scarlet the Witch, and it's right here at the nape of the 60s. It's 1964, and just before things are going to get turned upside down. Of course, in order for all of this to be able to really take ground, you have to have another ritual, which is the killing of Kennedy on 11/22/63. And again, I preface this by saying that whatever you think about what happened to Kennedy, whether he faked it or not, whatever, in the public's eye, he's still dead. It doesn't matter. He's gone, right? Gone. And I don't think he's Jimmy Carter. So you have to have something like that in order to punch the ritual, right? Like that's a huge ritual. Huge ritual. 11/22/33, Dallas, 33rd parallel, which is where it takes place. And then after that, everything tilts on its axis. Now, keep in mind that astrologically, Pluto and Uranus are in the sign of Virgo, which is important. It's an important part of the story because we're going from an Apollonian time with Pluto and Leo, right? It's an Apollonian time. Apollonian is Apollo and the sun. And it's like freaking high noon for America until about 1962. 52 to 62, with the emphasis on the Eisenhower years. And then everything just falls off the map. And there is some correlation with the Uranus-Pluto conjunction in Virgo, because Virgo is a feminine sign. It is not a masculine sign like Leo, obviously. It's a feminine sign. And the combination of Uranus and Pluto together are very powerful, right? Because the 60s are fueled by that Uranus-Pluto conjunction. And Uranus is revolutionary and radical. That's what Uranus represents. It's revolutionary and radical. And Pluto is all about death and transformation and to some extent rebirth. There's many other causations and correlations with Pluto, right? But those are the things that we know. So you bolt Uranus and Pluto together and you have this radically revolutionary time where the spirit of the age is this. This is what you're looking at. And I don't think it's any coincidence that it also dovetails with second wave feminism. And that all starts with Betty Friedan. And then by the time we get into the 1960s, like the late 1960s, second wave feminism has really taken off and has become more and more of a political force. More and more women are moving into the workplace. And this is all pre-Mary Tyler Moore. Like one of the first versions of what we're talking about is Margot Thomas in a TV series called That Girl. And she's single and she's, trying to make her way professionally, right? I think she lives in New Rochelle or someplace like that. I think of New Rochelle as being a part of that series. And her boyfriend is this guy, Donald Hollinger. So you can begin to see this, right? You can see this start to happen during the latter part of the 60s, 67 through 68, right? The entire programming begins to shift in very different kinds of ways. And that's all part of this second wave feminism, right? And not only that, but if you go to 1968, Chiron, like when a lot of this is happening, 1967, 1968, we're seeing this tectonic shift from going from this kind of Apollonian world, a world where it is defined by structure and order and form, and it is moving away from that. It's more lunar, it's more feminine, it's more ultimately Dionysic, right? Because Dionysus is the opposite of Apollonian. Dionysus is like the spirit of the moon, and Apollo is the spirit of the sun. Dionysus rules the night, Apollo rules the day. So in the 1960s, we begin to see nightfall on the world, but mostly on America. Right? It happens in a very big way here. And then we see also the rise of, you remember in the Matrix where Neo's being tested, and there's a scene where there's this stunning woman and she's all dressed in red, right? She's the whore of Babylon. She's the Scarlet Woman. And she is beautiful and exotic and erotic. And so what happens in the 60s is Playboy becomes mainstream. And so you get a centerfold every month with the Scarlet Woman. You get a centerfold every month with Babylon and the zeitgeist of the times. And they had these things before. They had pinups of Betty Grable and stuff like that, right? But it wasn't to the extent that it was being portrayed and mainstreamed. So this is what I'm talking about, right? There's something that comes over the 60s, astrologically, with Virgo and Pluto in Virgo and Uranus in Virgo, which is revolutionary, which is feminine, which is ultimately transformational with Pluto. And this is what happens. And it's not just the astrology, but I think that there's something that connects all the way back to Jack Parsons and Ron Hubbard, and then what they did. Okay, so there's some interesting things about this date, March 4th. Before I go to March 4th as a day, I'm going to show you the astrological chart for March 4th of 1964. I'm going to show you that chart because I have it. It's a very interesting chart. So this is the day that Scarlet the Witch makes her appearance in X-Men in Marvel Comics. So here we go, March 4th, 1964. I set this for New York City. And 8 a.m., because that's usually when the magazine, newspaper, and comic book vendors would show up in the morning and like stack the racks. Because that's how you would buy a comic. You'd buy it from a spinning rack. And like, look at this chart. To me, it is really fascinating. This is the day that Scarlet the Witch emerges. Venus in Aries, right? Like the feminine. Venus is the feminine and Aries is red. It's the color red. And we have Jupiter here, which expands the power of Venus. right? And what really rules the 60s in a lot of ways moving forward? It's the feminine. And as the decade continues to unfold, it is the feminine, not just in men, but also in women, but also men. Like what happens with men? They grow their hair long, right? They grow their hair long. And how many, what about that scene in Easy Rider when Dennis Hopper and Jack Nicholson and Peter Fonda are at the diner in the South, and they're commenting on how much they look like girls, right? So there's the feminization of men that's taking place in the 60s as well. And some people can say, well, there's another variant of that. If Jesus was a Virgo and he was born on 9/11, and we have Uranus in Virgo and Pluto in Virgo, well, maybe they're doing their best to somehow approximate and look like, what Jesus might have looked like. And in some ways that might even be true. But not everybody had a beard and long hair and, tried to cop a look like Jesus, right? But this is what happens to men during that time. They began to take on, more of a unisexual sort of vibe in the 60s, right? So you have theoretically the start of women becoming more like men because of feminism, and men theoretically becoming more like women. And it's through the appropriation of longer hairstyles. Little did we know, right? But to me, this is the day, right? This is the day that Scarlet the Witch makes her appearance in Marvel Comics. And then this is exactly what I'm talking about here with the Pluto-Uranus conjunction in Virgo, which is revolutionary feminine, transformational feminine. So you say to yourself, well, maybe this was really just the astrology. But if you go back and you listen to Kennedy's speech, his famous speech, which, by the way, happens under Pluto and Virgo. Uranus, I'd have to track. It might have been probably Virgo. Kennedy says the most famous line that underscores the spirit of Virgo. And the line is, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, right? That's astrological. That is the zeitgeist of Uranus and Pluto and Virgo. Kennedy is, giving us this line that's probably as emblematic as Roosevelt's, you have nothing to fear but fear itself. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That's what that's about, right? So you can make a case now that with the assassination of Kennedy and the ritual killing of the king, that this becomes something very different. What's also interesting here is that Lyndon Johnson is a Virgo. So it's fascinating that the guy who presides over all of this with the massive social change and the war on poverty and the Great Society and the guy who fucks up the Vietnam War is a custodian of the sign that these two planets are in. It's interesting. To me, it's interesting. What's up, PG? But I feel like this is what we get, right? We get the negative or the minor chord here. We're not thinking about serving our country anymore. It doesn't really happen, although some people go off to the Peace Corps or Vista or whatever, right? That doesn't happen. What ultimately people do is they indulge in this, for the most part, Dionysic excess, which culminates in all the great festivals at the end of the 1960s, and then ultimately culminates in Altamont, which is, the closing of the curtains, and then the death of all the rock stars, right? Jimmy, Brian Jones, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, they all happened like really quickly at that time. It's the closing of that era. But this is, and so why am I talking about this? Because when I look at what was happening with Nixon, and the country was on a cusp, like it was on a real cusp, and we could have theoretically, it would have been like really turning this massive aircraft carrier around in the middle of the Pacific, but much easier then than now, because Nixon had the right idea. He saw the future. Nixon saw the future, but he couldn't overcome what had descended upon the country. And what had descended upon the country, I don't think was a mere exercise of Tavistock or Langley or any of the other think tanks that have been engaged in social engineering. I think some of that is in there clearly. You've got the Phoenix Project, especially as it relates to Vietnam, which I don't think ever really shuts down. Eventually, of the emergence of MK Ultra, which they talk about later on in the 70s, but it's happening during the 60s. I mean, all these things are happening then, right? But I also feel like something else was happening, because we go from this pivot of what Virgo could be, what Kennedy was trying to tap into. I'll say it again. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That's what this was about, and it didn't happen. And we got tossed into the whirlwind of Dionysus. And I believe that whatever Hubbard and Parsons did, even though it's literally 20 years later, plays a role in the 60s. Now, as I was meandering around the internet, I found out that a famous city in the United States was founded on March 4th. And I'm like, oh, gee, that's an interesting city. And I'm asking a rhetorical question, but do you know what that city was? It was Chicago. So that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? When you see Chicago, how fucked up it is, it's a Pisces city. And again, hey, Pisces is not a curse sign, but you can see that with Chicago. Like Chicago is probably the worst version of Pisces in a lot of ways, right? It's just lower octave Pisces, and there's always there's always an easy scapegoat to find in Chicago, culminating in Juicy Smollett, who did all that in Chicago, didn't he? When he faked his little lynching at the hands of the two brothers who were wearing MAGA. Do you remember that? Come on, that wasn't that long ago. That wasn't that long ago. So, do you know who was born in Chicago? There she is. The lady in red. The Scarlet Woman. Born in Chicago. Chicago becoming a city on March 4th being the inauguration date of the arrival of Scarlet the Witch. Now, there are some people who believe that Hillary Clinton is an actual byproduct of that ritual. Now, I can't confirm that. And I guess I'm not really willing to deny it because it's an interesting thing to talk about, right? That's been mentioned, that Hillary Clinton is the byproduct, the physical byproduct of the Babalon Working. Now, whether or not she is, clearly she's a spiritual manifestation of it, because she was a huge player in the 20th century. And during the 1960s, eventually she's like hanging out with fucking Saul Alinsky, right? Or she's writing him letters telling him how much she loves him, and she bases her doctoral thesis on Saul Alinsky. And yeah. And how many times have we seen Hillary Clinton in red? A lot. It's not a color that she is opposed to wearing. So I think it's fascinating. And again, it's a 20-year cycle between kind of the last gasps of the Babalon Working between Parsons and Hubbard. And then it's like March of 1944, 1946, even less, 18 years. It's 18 years. Hold on. So Marjorie Cameron shows up in 46. So it's about what, 2 years after the ritual, 2 years after the Babalon Working. Let me just confirm this. '46. No, by 1946. So it's actually 18 years between 1946 and 1964, which is the age of consent. That's interesting. 18 years. So I think that this country, and possibly even the world, has been put under a spell, really under a spell. It's what it feels like. And everything in the spell makes a normal functioning world feel out of balance. And we're clearly way, way out of balance. Way out of balance right now. Like, so far fucking out of balance, it's not even funny. Now, one of the things that I wanted to kind of bring this forward with was the eclipse that's coming up, and then everything post-eclipse. I don't know about you, but in my life, I've seen this in my life, in other people's lives, and sometimes in social situations. There tends to be a buildup of energy. And when the energy gets too great, there is a backlash. Like, there has to be some kind of release in some way. And if we continue with this idea and this theme that we have been taken over by this spellcraft that you see clearly in the 1960s, and the diminishment of sort of these Apollonian forces in favor of the Dionysus. We are at the height of, in a lot of ways, the sort of the Dionysic depths. So instead of the drugs that were freely available during the 19th or widely available during the 1960s, drugs like marijuana, hashish, LSD, mescaline, cocaine, heroin, speed, STP. These were the drugs of the 1960s, right? Now we have fentanyl. Now we have all these incredibly powerful drugs, but they're still drugs nonetheless. They keep the populace narcoticized. They keep them in a state of not just perpetual slumber, but in some cases, even possession. If you've seen people on the streets, the victims of fentanyl, they look possessed. They hear voices. They do things that are strange and unusual. And sometimes they're a danger to themselves and others in very visible ways. So we have all of that. And then we have this again, and I will go back to the beginning of the show. There's an imbalance in our system of the feminine right now that is engaged in judgment. It's engaged in the abuse of power. It's engaged in the domination of the masculine spirit. Now, again, whatever you think of Donald Trump, he is a symbol. He's a symbol, right? He is a symbol for the thing that I'm talking about. And if you look at where we are with the nodes, where's the South Node right now? It's in Libra. And what does Libra rule? Well, it's ruled by Venus, but Libra rules fairness, balance, justice, and law. And what are we seeing? We're seeing clearly through this crazy fucking expose with Fannie Willis in Georgia that the scales of justice are way out of balance. Way out of balance. And there are people who are taking advantage of their position in order to exact a personal brand or politically motivated form of justice. And the so-called henchmen aren't even men at all, for the most part. So there are some, don't get me wrong. Merrick Garland tries to pretend he's one. But this is what we're looking at, right, with the South Node. So keep all that in mind now. We have a continuum. Really, it's a continuum of where all this started in the 1960s. And we have reached this kind of peak of what started then. And what it looked like then was sort of the birth of, the white liberal woman, the white liberated woman who would become liberal. And then as a result of that, right, we now have what we're seeing in the public, right, whether it's at a state level, at a city level, at a federal level, what poses for justice. And it has become so egregious. You can't help but not notice this thing. Keep in mind the true node is in Aries. We've got this eclipse coming up in Aries. And we have Saturn and Neptune also coming in Aries in 2025. So when I see the eclipse, we talked about the eclipse last week. I also see the eclipse as this backlash of everything that I've been talking about. Because everything I've been talking about, again, classically feminine, ruled by Venus. Men are from Mars, women from Venus. And then we have the spirit of Dionysus, which is lunar, the lunar invocation. And now we have coming to a city near you an overabundance of Mars. And even when Saturn and Neptune conjoin, we will have a lot of Mars. Mars administrated through Saturn and Neptune. And the backlash for all of this, think about how long this has been building up for. Long time. Long time. Again, since the 60s. So theoretically, to correct what's taken place and to achieve some balance, which is really what we would like to have, right? We'd like to have a balance between the masculine and the feminine, a balance between law and order, a balance between the spirit and the flesh, right? I mean, theoretically, that's what we would like. We'd be able to operate our lives and our world probably a lot more easy with a more balanced approach. But in order to get there, and I'm not saying that I'm advocating this, but in order to get there, feels to me like there's going to be a harsh backlash and a whiplash that is coming, and it's coming through this invocation. Remember, go back to what Jack Parsons did when he grounded, theoretically, Ron's boat. He invoked Bart Sabel, the spirit of Mars. Shipwrecked Hubbard in Northrop. And that's where we're headed. This is where we're headed. You know, is it going to be an overcorrection? Are we going to wind up in a world that looks like the Handmaid's Tale? Are we going to wind up in a world where Christian nationalism looks more like Christo-fascism? Or I mean, are we going to overcorrect here? Was this what's coming? Is an overcorrection? Because when I see on the horizon with the eclipse and Aries and Mars and Saturn, Neptune, it just feels like an overcorrection. That's what it feels like. It feels like this is a long time coming, right? The redressing of the balance. And maybe, I don't know, maybe for some people that's what it'll look like. Maybe it's just a matter of like men finally stepping up and saying, I'm going to be a fucking man in my life now, versus sitting at home and, jerking off and playing video games, or sitting around, at home and jerking off watching porn, or sitting around jerking off and saying, what can this place do for me and not what I can do for the place? Maybe this is going to be the changing of the tide here. And I know we got a bunch of, look, I think Gen Z gets a bad rap. I know a lot of Gen Z young men, and they're good dudes, and they're based, and they don't like the world that's been set up for them. I've interacted with them a lot. I have a Gen Z son, right? So I've done that. But that's what it feels like. It feels like we're headed towards what could possibly be an overcorrection of the time that we've been in. And it's like, well, we ask the question, then what do we do? Like, what if everything that I'm talking about has some merit and some truth? Because if you look at that time, that's exactly what happened. We fell under this Dionysic spell, and we have not been able to waken from the slumber of it since. And as we stir from our slumber, as we are about to kind of pull the covers off, all of a sudden Nurse Ratched comes in and gives us another dose of something, right? To put us back into this state of sleep and under the spell of whatever it is that and I'm convinced it happened. And maybe, again, it's a byproduct of the military industrial complex, the CIA, Tavistock, you name it, right? Boom, Hollywood. But again, a lot of these apparati are manifestations, especially Hollywood, of the collective unconscious, and that it reveals what's going on at a much deeper level. So I just wanted to explore this whole kind of path from Parsons and Hubbard and this idea of the Babalon working, which, by the way, came at the hands of a woman who was an Aries. And of course, we have the birth of Scarlet the Witch with Venus and Jupiter in Aries on the 4th of March, 1964. And I just thought this is interesting. And even what goes on with Hubbard. And who knows? We don't have the full story for everything. We have some births that are attributed to like this guy, what was his name? Winthrop Smith or whatever. Like his kid was attributed to being Jack Parsons' kid, which probably isn't true. But we don't know. We don't know the full story. We don't know if Hillary Clinton really might have been the byproduct of all this. But at the same time, without any real threads, it's hard to make the connection to say that is exclusively the case. But we do know that that Hillary Clinton's own daughter probably isn't Bill's kid. But that's another story for another show. But you can see how that works, right? And that gets back to the beginning of the show. We were talking about these monarchs and how a lot of them are really just dudes dressed as women. And then the kids have to come into the picture somehow, are sired by other people. Well, it sounds like a recent presidency, if I'm not mistaken. That's how that game works. So this was a journey into the 60s, a journey into the realm of Dionysus, a journey into the world of spellcraft, a journey into exploring this idea of Babylon, the Scarlet Woman, the woman in red, and the manifestation in 1964 of Scarlet the Witch at the beginning of the 60s, on the tail end of the Kill King ritual by Kennedy, the inversion of the Pluto and Virgo conjunction with Uranus and Virgo, where it becomes something different. It starts off as one thing, but it becomes something different during the 60s, right? It's where men become more like women as they become more liberated, and women become more like men as they become more liberated, and men become more like women as they become, I suppose, unliberated, disliberated. And in the background, of course, you have the wounded version of Apollo, right? That's all part of the background program as well. You have the men who were fighting in the Vietnam War. And eventually, when they come home, they begin to come home. They come home during a time when Chiron is in Aries. And they are literally the wounded warriors. They're physically wounded, they're psychically wounded, and America rejects them. Right? They come back and the world has gone mad. A lot of these guys, when they left, if they did, let's say they did 3 turns. They go in 1965, and the world is a very different place when they come out in 1968, if they do 3. And there are guys that did 3. Some did 2, and I'm out of here. Right? Some did 2, I'm out of here. So by the time they get back, and I've seen videos of these guys who were in just the heat of the battle, the heat of the jungle, the heat of the mountains, that are in Cambodia, Delta Force, the best of the fucking best, right? And they come back and they get off the plane in their full attire, their medals and everything, because they're proud of what they did. and people are jeering them at the airport. These are true stories. True stories. And these guys are going through their brains like, I could close the distance on that son of a bitch in about 3.5 seconds, and I could end his miserable existence. These were conversations these guys were having in their brains. So this is Chiron and Aries, right? Chiron and Aries, the wounded warriors, they're coming home. Now, Aries had not been discovered then. I mean, Chiron had not been discovered then. That'd be 1977 when it would be in Taurus. But looking back, it was in Aries. And where is Chiron now? It's in Aries again, right? It's right around those same degrees. Maybe a little bit later. And so we look around again, and it's not the warriors who are coming home wounded physically and psychically from Vietnam. It's the men themselves who live within the boundaries of this country. Very wounded. And it's just these cycles in time just fascinate me. Really fascinate me. So when we get into Aries at the end of 2025, it is the signal of a new period, a new epic, right? A new time. And one I think that's going to be actually quite strange in a lot of ways. And we've talked about it before. Of course, we'll talk about it more as time goes on. But we got the eclipse ahead of us. And it feels to me like the eclipse, it could be one of those just, catalytic events where we begin to experience the beginning of like an overcorrection. Even though I think what Mars and Cancer, Mars in Pisces and Saturn in Pisces are conjunct. When I was looking at that eclipse chart last week, some people were not clear on what I was trying to get at. So in order to clarify that, the eclipse chart starts with Uranus in Taurus and ends with Pluto in Aquarius. And the key point is the Saturn-Mars conjunction. Like, what kind of order coheres through the eclipse? Because that's what happens, right? With Mars and Saturn come together, there's a coherence of order. You go back and you look at what's interesting. You go back and look at that March 4th chart of 1946 with the Babalon Working, and you have Saturn and Mars together, right? Except they're in Cancer and not Pisces. Anyway, it's just an interesting observation, the two positions of Saturn and Mars. But that's really what I was trying to get at last week, because Mary brought that up over on Twitter. And we went through sort of the locomotive pattern, and that the outcome, which was Pluto, was going to be determined by the order that's established through Saturn Mars. And again, we can take a guess as to what that might be. Fuck, if there's 3 days of darkness after the eclipse, we don't know what that order is going to look like. And I could dig down into to the best of my ability and try to envision it. But when you get Saturn Mars together, you're dealing with a more hands-on version of Mars, right? That's like kind of a police state. Saturn's the state, and Mars represents warriors and defenders and centurions and cops. So you put Saturn Mars together, it's kind of a vision of a police state, actually. And that's what happens when you get Saturn and Aries and Neptune together. Oh boy. What kind of religious ideals are going to power that time? That'll be very interesting. But I think the beginning of the correction starts with the eclipse. That's my sense. Because again, even though Pluto was in Virgo and Uranus during that time, and not in Libra, which would have been the opposite of Aries, it's still significant. Virgo is still a feminine sign. And all the feminine signs are basically under the rulership of either Venus or the moon, ultimately. So there you go. There's a little backtrack in time, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was meaningful and that you got something out of it. And well, what do we do with this now, Robert? What the hell do we do with this? Well, I always think it's a good exercise to understand the ties that have bound us and to be able to untie those ties. And for me, and I've talked about this before, um, when I was a kid growing up, just like most kids in America, even though I grew up in California in the Bay Area, not far from San Francisco, where it was very, very psychedelic and Dionysic. I believed in America and loved America. Like that was the thing as a kid that you were just brought up on. At least when I was young, I was still kind of drafting off the fumes of the Eisenhower era as a young kid, right? Um, and then, of course, you have all these things that happened to the United States during that period of time, which culminates in the resignation of Nixon. And, I've said this before, but that really demoralized me as a kid. When I sat there and watched him resign, it was, I felt something change in me. And I became more cynical and arch. And that was for me the kind of the culmination of this demoralization program that clearly was in effect as well. And going back and watching all these hours of Nixon has done a couple of things. Number one is that it's redeemed my opinion of Richard Nixon. Not perfect, but I mean, he's fucking, I don't know, Churchill, Roosevelt, de Gaulle, and whatever reasonable personage that represents leadership rolled into one compared to what we have on our plate today. Nixon was cut from a different cloth, a different man from another time. And what I saw has redeemed my vision of Nixon as an individual and somebody who got really fucked over. And so that led me deeper again to understand. And I've always known this, right? But it led me deeper to understand why and how this all happened, why and how what had occurred during the Eisenhower era for about 10 years went so drastically south so quickly. And we can get into the fourth turn, the first turning, the second turning, third turning. That's part of the story too. But if you take into account that a major ritual and a spell had been either intentionally or unintentionally cast upon this land and even this world, then it makes things look different, right? An entirely different light. And even again, if you look at Kennedy with that Pluto Virgo, Uranus Virgo conjunction, the spirit of service, ask not what the country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That's gone. That's all gone. And it takes on a very different animus, doesn't it? And really, it becomes a time that is, well, very self indulgent in a lot of ways. The 60s are kind of self indulgent, and it's fun, it's pop, it's all, there's a lot of things that go along with the 60s, but it doesn't continue with that call to renew your relationship with America, which is what Kennedy was basically saying. And then Johnson says, well, y'all are going to get a free ticket. You're going to love me, and I'm going to get reelected. Right? That's what Johnson does. A Virgo. All right. I think that's it for tonight's show. We'll be back on Tuesday with the Astro weather, and we'll get into where we are Astro weather-wise on Tuesday. I guess we're doing serious sports every other week. So not this Tuesday or not this Monday, but the following Monday, because we're going to get back on track with Mondays. The following Monday, we will do serious sports with Mr. Al Dog. So we'll do that. In the meantime, don't forget our partner here on this show, True Hemp Science, and our friend Chris produces some of the best CBD products that you can find on the internet. They're all organically sourced. And he's an absolute magician when it comes to crafting what you need through CBD. And if you go to truehempscience.com, you spend $150 or more, just type in 15MINS and you'll get a free goodie bag. I guarantee you, you're going to get some things in there you're going to like, and they'll make your purchase worth it. Not only will what you're getting be worth the purchase, but the goodies are the goodies that say, man, I'm glad I bought this because this was really good. $150 more, get you free shipping. There's always a 30-day money-back guarantee. If you have any questions, go to truehempscience.com, reach out to Chris, make an appointment, and he will guide you to your best CBD choices. Mods, thank you very much for all that you do. Chataria, you're the absolute best. It's the best chat group on the internet, bar none, hands down. Love you all. And by the way, I am in the business of being an astrologer. So if you want to do a reading, reach out to me. And you can find that in the link for the show notes, robertphoenix.com. Thank you all very much. Take good care, and bye for now.